there's always babies. She decided she didn't. I was doing it for Milwaukee.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad that you are here with us this morning. I'm Eric Clark. I'm pastor here at Sherwood and Mountain Home, and today we're gathering for some study, for some reflection, for some diving into historical critical methods of studying Scripture, which are a more academic approach to trying to understand the sources and processes of creation of biblical texts, and then how those biblical texts have been interpreted through the years. We're going to be together for about 3 hours today, and I think we'll be able to get through a lot of really interesting material. Feel free at any point, this is meant to be a conversation, so feel free at any point to, raise a hand, ask a question. This should be interactive. Don't feel constrained. It's not, although I will do some talking, I don't expect it to take the format primarily of a lecture. We're going to break in and do some conversation in small groups, so it'd probably be good if you're seated with at least 2 or 3 other people that you want to talk to at various points during the process. While we're doing that, there should be some scrap paper and some Bibles on your tables, so you can grab those, or if you brought your own Bibles and such, that's great as well, so you can use them. I am a few times today going to call for people, just so it's not all my voice, I'm going to call for people to maybe read aloud scripture passages. If you're someone who, I'm not going to put you on the spot, but if you're someone who would be interested or able or willing to do that, just when I say I have a Bible passage I need read, you just raise a hand and I'll call on you in that way. That way we can hear some voices that aren't just mine this morning when we read them aloud. And we do have the New International Version, as well as I have the New Revised Standard Version, which is the version I'll mostly be using for the translations for scripture passages. Are there any general process questions or anything before we begin? Anything or announcements from our volunteers and staff that have helped make it all work?
We have chili with meat on it for everybody for lunch. Those of you who are vegetarians, we also have a small pot that Mary brought of vegetarian chili. We'll have cornbread and then desserts and salads. So just wanted to say if you're not a meat eater, you're not a carnivore, there is vegetarian chili.
Beautiful. Awesome. Thank you for that hospitality. So we have a rough agenda over here. You can see there's about 45-minute stretches of work and then breaks. So we have a break, and then we'll have lunch, and then we'll end after the third chunk on there. That gives you an idea of what to expect for what's coming ahead. All right. With all that said, then let's get into it. Today we're going to be talking about the book of Joshua. Joshua is maybe a text that is not one that you have possibly spent that much time in. It is not very commonly selected as a text for preaching in worship. It appears only at a very couple spots on the Revised Common Lectionary, and on those Sundays where it appears, pastors tend to read the gospel passage and not the Joshua passages. So if you have read or studied Joshua, it may have been on another Bible study or on your own, or maybe it's through some storytelling and stuff that has been done in Sunday school. There is the Jericho story, or a couple other passages from Joshua that sometimes get picked up as taught in Sunday school contexts. But often Joshua is completely left out of church education because it's quite a challenging text. It does not present us with a lot that appears from a lay Christian perspective to be good news. And so it's an interesting text because of the fact that it's understudied and less understood. It is also, in scholarly opinion and in my opinion, extremely important to understanding what was going on in the construction of what we call the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, what is for Jewish people their scriptures. The construction of the Old Testament is something that took place over centuries and involved many different authors and contributors, and it has been sort of pieced together and there's not a universal consensus, to be clear. There's no one understanding of how the Hebrew Bible was put together. But it's broadly agreed that it took a long time and there were many contributors. And as such, it's important to sort of like pull out different parts of it and guess and try to interpret in through the reading of it how those parts came to be and what was going on in the context and time in which those parts were created. So to understand Joshua, we're going to do so today through the lens of three people. The first person is Josiah. Josiah was king of Judah from the year 641 BCE to 610 BCE. I'm not asking you to memorize names and dates today, but sometimes it's helpful to have things on a board, okay? So that's not the actual important part, the name and date. But what is important is to understand his context and his role, who he was. So this is a map of the ancient Near East around the time that Josiah was king in Judah. And in the time that Josiah was king in Judah, it had already been for a couple centuries by that point that the kingdoms of Israel and Judah were small in comparison to their very powerful imperial neighbors. So I've kind of pointed to some of the large imperial neighbors that were around in the region. Assyria to the north, Egypt to the south and west, Babylon to the east, and further east and north, Persia, which came a little bit later after the period that we're currently talking about. But all of these imperial powers were always vying for control of the region. They were vying for control of the region, and the road which went from the north to the south went directly through what we understand as the ancient kingdom of Israel and Judah. And as such, this was a major trade route, but it was also just sort of in the way of all of these competing powers' desires to want to war and trade with each other. And so Israel was sort of traded hands among the various empires in terms of who was in control of that region at different times. And the ways that the empires of the day exercised control over subordinate provinces was through proxy rulers. In other words, Israel and Judah would have their own king, but that king would be subject to the emperor of Assyria or something, would have to pay tribute, basically like taxes, and would have to send men from Israel to join the Assyrian army or to serve in the thing. They would be forced by the Assyrian emperor or the Egyptian pharaoh or the Babylonian emperor to serve at the interests of the greater imperial power who had sway or influence in the region at the time. And as such, Israel was always sort of like in this position of having to wanting its independence, but having to negotiate with much bigger and powerful forces on its sides that were against it. Also, sometimes trying to do like a kid will do with parents is like try to play them against each other. So sometimes Israel would like try to like make friends with Egypt in order to push Assyria away, or then make friends with Assyria to try to push Egypt away. Like they were kind of caught in the middle of these struggles between these imperial powers. Furthermore, I keep saying the kingdoms of Israel and Judah because at the time they were two separate kingdoms. They were two separate groups. The kingdom in the northern chunk, which comprised most of the people of ancient Israel, it was 10 of the 12 tribes, and the majority of the populace, the majority of the farming, the majority of the resources, there was, its capital was in Samaria. And the southern kingdom of Judah, its capital was in Jerusalem. Now, the Bible that we have was largely composed in the temple in Jerusalem and reflects the perspective of the house of David, which were the ruling dynasty in Judah. And as such, our perspective is often that Judah was the most important because that's the scriptures we read. But historically speaking, Judah was the smaller, the less powerful, the less wealthy of the two. And precisely, in fact, because it was the smaller, less powerful, and less wealthy, it kind of got away with a little bit less interference from the neighbors, because there was less reason to try to pillage Judah than there was to try to pillage Israel. As such, at the time of Josiah, who we're going to read about and talk about here in just a second, the northern kingdom had already been essentially conquered by Assyria, and the kings of Samaria had been killed, the line ended, or taken into exile, and Israel was being fully ruled, annexed as a province of Assyria. Jerusalem was still kind of independent, but in treaties with both Egypt and Babylon to try to keep Assyria from continuing their conquest further south and taking over Judah. So Jerusalem was, Judah was sort of like afraid that Assyria any day would decide to gobble up the rest of the territory, and aware that what happened here in Israel could happen here in Judah, but at the same time didn't want to get too cozy with these people, because either of them also, these were not really friends. These are just the enemy of my enemy situation. So Israel's in this very, very tenuous situation when we're going to read about Josiah, which is that, or Judah is in this very, very tenuous situation, which is that most of their kinsmen, most of their tribes folk that share the same language, worship the same God, have the same culture as them, are currently conquered by Assyria and ruled by Assyria. And they don't want to suffer that same fate and are trying to figure out how to navigate that tenuous political situation that they're in. So now let's learn about who Josiah was as a person. I am going to look for a couple different readers. We're looking to turn to 1 Kings chapter 22. So, 1 Kings chapter 22. Oh. Sorry, I had the wrong. 2 Kings chapter 22.
I was going to say that.
Yeah.
Doesn't sound like.
Nope.
Josiah.
Yep. 2 Kings chapter 22. Carol, would you? Yeah, would that be great? You're going to start us. Why don't you read? Yeah, why don't you just read the first couple verses and pause, and then we'll continue from there.
Okay. So the book of the law found. Josiah was 8 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 31 years. His mother's name was Jedidah, daughter of Adiah, and she was from, I should have asked if there was hard words, Bozkath. She was from Bozkath. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord and walked in all the ways of his father David, not turning aside to the right or to the left.
Great. We'll pause there for a second. All right. So this is just Josiah, king. He became king at 8 years old there, and it has this description of him that he walked in the way of his father David and did not turn aside to the right or the left. I just want you to remember that line. It will come up again. Carol, do you want to go ahead and continue for the next?
Sure.
Yeah, let's read till about verse 10 or so.
Okay. In the 18th year of his reign, King Josiah sent the secretary, Shaphan, son of Azaliah, the son of Meshullam, to the temple of the Lord. He said, "Go up to Hilkiah, the high priest, and have him get ready the money that has been brought into the temple of the Lord, which the doorkeepers have collected from the people. Have them entrust it to the men appointed to supervise the work on the temple, and have these men pay the workers who repair the temple of the Lord, the carpenters, the builders, and the masons. Also have them purchase timber and dressed stone to repair the temple. But they need not account for the money entrusted to them, because they are acting faithfully." Hilkiah the high priest said to Shaphan, the secretary, "I have found the book of the law in the in the temple of the Lord. He gave it to Shaphan, who read it. Then Shaphan, the secretary, went to the king and reported to him, "Your officials have paid out the money that was in the temple of the Lord and have entrusted it to the workers and supervisors at the temple." Then Shaphan, the secretary, informed the king, "Hilkiah, the priest, has given me a book." And Shaphan read from it in the presence of the king.
Okay. So, this significant event happens in Josiah's reign. They find a book of the law in the temple. It's like a scene from like an Indiana Jones movie or a National Treasure movie or something like that, right? Like somehow, we don't know how, the priests have just lost a whole book of the law they didn't even know existed. A back shelf of the library or something, or a room that they haven't been in a while. They open up this new room and they find a book of the law that is there. It does not tell us what this book of law is, other than that it is a book of law. It does not tell us the name of the book of law. The ancient practice of naming books was just to use the first few words or the first line of a text in Cheapbeat, it's called in Latin, which is to say the beginning of a text. So Genesis is called Genesis because the first few words of Genesis are in the beginning, which is what Genesis means. So they didn't have our custom of like giving things their own names, and so because of that, we don't know what this book of law is called. And there have been lots of different theories about what this book of law is, one of which is broadly agreed is the most plausible theory, and that's what I'm going to share with you today. But the important thing here is that Josiah's priests find a book, and this is a very important event. So may I have a second reader continue, Diane? You want to start from 11, and let's just read to the end of the chapter, and then we'll pause there.
Okay. When the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his robes. He gave these orders to Hilkiah the priest, Ahikam son of Shaphan, Achbor son of Micaiah, Shaphan the secretary, and Asaiah the king's attendant. Go and inquire of the Lord for me and for the people, and for all of Judah about what is written in this book that has been found. Great is the Lord's anger that burns against us, because our fathers have not obeyed the words of this book. They have not acted in accordance with all that is written there concerning us. Hilkiah the priest, Ahikam, Achbor, Shaphan, and Asaiah went to speak to the prophetess Huldah, who was the wife of Shallum, son of Tikvah, the son of Harkes, keeper of the wardrobe. She lived in Jerusalem in the 2nd district. She said to them, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Tell the man who sent you to me. This is what the Lord says. I am going to bring disaster on this place and its people, according to everything written in the book the king of Judah has read, because they have forsaken me and burned incense to other gods and provoked me to anger by all the idols their hands have made. My anger will burn against this place and will not be quenched. Tell the king of Judah who sent you to inquire of the Lord. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says concerning the words you have heard. Because your heart was responsive and you humbled yourself before the Lord when you heard what I have spoken against this place and its people, that they would become accursed and laid waste, and because you tore your robes and wept in my presence, I have heard you, declares the Lord. Therefore I will gather you to your fathers, and you will be buried in peace. Your eyes will not see all the disaster I am going to bring on this place. So they took her answer back to the king.
Okay. So they find this book of the law, they read it to the king, and Josiah has a very pious reaction, a very dramatic, pious reaction. He tears his clothes, a sign of repentance and lamentation. He orders the priests to figure out how this happened, how could we have missed or lost this, and what are we going to do about it? Because in this book of law, there are laws that Israel and Judah have not been following, and the understanding of the prophets and the priests and the king who are reading this is that this is the explanation for why Israel was conquered by Assyria and Judah is in such danger right now, because they have not been being faithful to these newly discovered laws, because God is mad at them because they haven't been being faithful. Yeah, I see your hand.
In the text, they speak of the Lord as somebody who's right there. They're talking to the Lord. In our concept, we think the Lord is God. They're talking to God. So, but in the old days, the kings considered themselves the Lord. The emperors were the Lord. They were all divine people who considered themselves to be gods to go into heaven when they die and so on. So who are they actually referring to here when they speak of the Lord? It sounds like somebody who's right outside the door.
Yeah, that's a great question. Judah is a little bit different than some of her ancient Near Eastern neighbors in that we're actually going to read a little bit about how kings were understood in Judah. In that kings are not understood to be divine. They are just understood to be anointed, that is, blessed by God, chosen by God, but not to themselves to be divine. Kings are actually significantly less powerful in Judah and Israel than in their neighboring kingdoms there. But in the worship of Yahweh in the temple in Jerusalem, the belief is that at the time that the temple is the literal footstool of God, that God sits on a throne in heaven, but God's feet rest on a footstool in the temple. And so the priests can go and talk directly to God through divination. So you perform sacrifices of animals, and then you ask questions after having given a sacrifice, and depending upon the ashes and the smoke of the sacrifice, God gives signs to the priests that the priests can interpret and then say, this is what God is saying. So when they say they're talking to the Lord, what they mean is literally they're going into the temple, they're burning a bull on an altar, and they're asking God for what God does God want, and then they're coming out and they're telling the king, this is what the Lord says.
So the Lord is telling them, woe be to you, we're going to screw you over.
The Lord is saying to them, you neglected all these laws that you should have been following. You should have been following him. This is why you're in trouble now.
So this is primarily made up by the guy who came from speaking to the Lord to the other people.
This is how they understood it. Yeah, this is how they understood how the process works. Yeah. So Josiah is this book of the law creates a problem. The problem is there's all these new laws we have to follow that we've already broken many of them we didn't know, so we have to fix it. So we have to go. So we need a reform movement, and the reform has several things that it is concerned about. It's concerned about idols, which I'll talk about what we mean by idols. It's concerned about intermarriage, which I'll talk about what that means. And it's concerned about worship in the temple. So what Josiah's priests are basically saying to Josiah is that because the people in Israel, in the northern half, in Samaria, have not been faithful to Yahweh alone because they've worshipped other gods besides Yahweh, because they've intermarried with their neighbors, and because they don't worship in the temple in Jerusalem, which is the footstool where God is, because they worship in Samaria and other places besides Jerusalem, because they're breaking these rules, Assyria conquered them, that's why. And if we want to prevent it, well, we need to convince everyone that the temple is where they have to come to worship, that they have to not intermarry with their neighbors, and we have to we have to get rid of all the idols that are in the territory. Those are the main things. There's maybe some other things, but those are the main things that the priests are telling Josiah need to happen if he wants his reign to last, and if he wants something which we're going to talk about what he wants is not just to last, but to maybe reunite the two kingdoms and be able to be king of both of them instead of just to be king of the smaller portion down south in Judah. So Josiah sets about this reform campaign to try to do this. And this defines the rest of his period as monarch, sets about trying to accomplish this. Historians and archaeologists disagree to what degree the campaign was successful, i.e. how much he actually did what he said or how much he just said he was going to do these things. But he clearly said he was going to do these things because he put out a whole bunch of writings about it, put out a whole bunch of stuff to the people. There was a lot of documentation saying this is the program of my monarchy. This is the program of the House of David under Josiah. This is what we're going to do. Is there. Now, these laws are like any law, which is that they only exist to express something that is actually already happening. Laws are responses to circumstances generally there. So I wonder if you can think, and anyone you can just popcorn out can think of any examples of laws you've seen broken. You don't have to out yourself if you were the one breaking them, but you can say, if laws you've seen broken any time in the last month. Any law you've seen broken any time in the last month. Speeding, sure. Yeah, any other laws you've seen broken in the last month?
Stop signs.
Yeah, people rolling through stop signs or lights.
People on their cell phones.
Huh?
Overdue library.
Overdue library books, yeah. Driving on the cell phone. Yeah, traffic laws are easy, right? Because we're out, that's what we see when we're out in public there. There's probably others. There's probably, if we thought about it, we'd be maybe not even aware of some of them, but if we thought about it, there's probably all kinds of like zoning laws and things. If we walk through a neighborhood, we could be like, oh, that tree's leaning too far over the fence, or those weeds are 2 inches too high, or I don't know, or that house has not got permits for the extension they're adding on to whatever they added there, or I'm sure there's a bunch of others that we can think of that are part of that. Before we get to any real serious laws, we can deal with a whole bunch of code violations and stuff. Not reporting your income for taxes. Yeah. Yeah.
Nobody did that.
Absolutely. Yeah. So what we can say for certain, without having to be, great archaeologists, is that we know that these laws exist because these things were happening, not because these things weren't happening. In other words, these were the normal, common expressions of the things. The laws were there because they were perceived to be necessary because of what was common practice in what's going on. And we can talk about some of what we mean by this. So it was common practice in worship of Yahweh for hundreds of years prior to what scholars call the Second Temple period, which is after the siege of Babylon and the sack and everything. So this is later than we're currently in. There, it was common practice in ancient Israel to basically be a follower of one God, but that didn't mean you denied the existence of other gods. It just meant that you were primarily faithful to one God. That was your God. The other gods, though, I mean, you didn't want them angry at you, so you might do something to get them off your back once in a while, make an offering somewhere, pay a tribute somewhere. They all had different things that they were prioritized in different ways that were there. So if you worship Yahweh, if you are a Yahwist and a member of the people in Israel, you will follow Torah, do your best to be part of that life. At big festival days, you might make the journey up to the temple or something if it's necessary for your family or if it seems like it's possible. But that's a lot of work and a lot of effort. But you also don't want a thunderstorm coming and mowing down your crops, and you know that Baal can do that, so you go over once in a while and you give a little sacrifice to Baal because you don't want him to come and destroy your crops. Yeah.
Just like political contributions today.
Yeah.
Both Democrats and Republicans.
Yeah. You're like, okay, I would prefer this person get elected, but I want whoever gets elected to be indebted to me, so I want them to, spread it around a little bit so that I make sure that, however it goes, the outcome's a little better for me, right? That was normal. Not only that, but earlier practices of Yahweh seem to hold that Yahweh self wasn't, like our understanding of worship is very late, very monotheistic perspective of worship. In earlier versions of it, Yahweh kind of sat in a council of gods. The older names for him are things like Elohim, which is a plural name, which means like divine council. and Elohim was like the chief of the council, the high judge. But there were other gods in the council, and those other gods, would argue back and forth about how things should be. And so that you didn't, you mostly needed Yahweh on your side, but that didn't mean these other people couldn't help your case if maybe they could help persuade Yahweh to help you out if you could work with the other council. Yahweh, in earlier traditions, had a wife. Asherah is her name. And Asherah appears at a bunch of places in our Old Testament, in our Hebrew Bible, as a divine feminine figure that was Yahweh's companion in those things. And so it was typical to have what was called an Asherah pole, which is basically a tree, a young tree, that you keep, and you would do things like pour goat milk at the base of the tree as an offering to Asherah. This is mostly about getting favor with Yahweh, because you want Yahweh to help you, so you are nice to Yahweh's wife. If you want the big guy, the powerful person to help you, you don't piss off his wife. That's not going to help your case. So those were common practices of the period. Now, all of those practices have some traits in common, which is that they're very difficult to centralize and regulate. If you can worship Asherah by just planting a tree by your house and pouring some goat milk on the tree, you don't need a priest. You don't need a temple. You don't need a whole bunch of rules in a document explaining it to you. Grandma taught you the rules. You know what grandma knows how to worship Asherah. So you don't need to go to Jerusalem and ask the priesthood to perform an expensive divination ritual. Killing a bull is expensive. To perform an expensive divination ritual to tell you something, if you can just go to the tree in your front yard, pour some milk on it, and if it blooms that year and you get good blooms, then you have a positive omen, a sign. You know things are going well for you. What do you need the priesthood for? So the temple has a vested interest in convincing people that all these other forms of worship are not acceptable to Yahweh, are not acceptable to God. They have a vested interest in convincing everyone that the only proper way to worship Yahweh is to go to the temple and to use the temple's resources in order to do so. The king maybe doesn't care that much about the temple, but the king wants all this territory back. And he needs some political justification for how he can do that. And he needs some way to get people on his side to see that there's some reason. And if he can come up with an explanation for why Assyria conquered them, why they've had such a bad time lately, and why Judah hasn't, something different about Judah than is about Israel, something that makes Judah seem like the last bastion of faithful people, then he has a good argument for why he should be the one to be able to reclaim the other territory and to get them to follow him. Well, the main difference between Judah and Israel is where you worship. They both worship the same God. They both have the same language, similar culture, similar traditions, very much interrelated, married. My cousin married your cousin from that tribe, from that. Like, we're all part of the same family tree. But in Judah, the capital and the site of worship is Jerusalem. And so if he can side with the priests and say, hey, everybody, you're supposed to worship in Jerusalem, and this is why Judah has been protected from Assyria, everybody who's not been protected from Assyria might listen to him when he says, I should be your king. Okay? So Josiah has this reform program that he is trying to implement with a goal, and the temple is supporting him in this goal. They're supporting him by helping him craft a narrative that there's these laws that we have not been following, that's why we're in trouble. And if we follow these laws, God will bless us and protect us. God will drive our enemies away. Assyria and Babylon and Egypt, God will protect us from them. We'll be able to get back together again, and things will be better for all of us. Coincidentally, Josiah will get to be king of everybody, and the temple will get to have everybody's worship and everybody's tithes and everybody's donations. Both institutions benefit from allying in order to craft this narrative, in order to put this out. Any questions about this before we move on to the next part of Josiah's story? Yes?
So the real question is, who planted the Book of Law?
That's a great question. I mean, there's no answer, right? Like, unfortunately, there's that version of the temple was razed to the ground. The archaeologists have never found. Was it actually planted? Some scholars think it was genuine, that they actually found a document as there. These things, it might have been more opportunistic than intentional, as in they might have found something and said, this is our chance to use it for this purpose. Yeah, a sign, exactly. I'm also by no means imputing that these people were not sincere in their beliefs. Like, the priests in the temple believed in Yahweh, believed in worshiping Yahweh in the temple, believed that this was the right way to do it. They weren't lying about that, but they also, of course, had vested interest in trying to get other people to also believe as they believed and worshipped as they worshipped. All right, so let's actually jump back a little bit to understand what happened and why Josiah's narrative, why this narrative might be compelling to people. So I am going to 1 Kings. It's 1 Kings 11. And it's in verse 26, we're just going to read we're actually just going to read those first two verses, and then we're going to go to chapter 12. So do I have a potential volunteer as a reader here? Great. Carol? Chapter 11, verse 26 and 27.
I only go to verse 21.
In chapter 11 of 1 Kings?
Oh, all right. I'm in the wrong case.
Ah.
First Kings 11.
Yep, 26 and 27.
Okay, I'm almost there. Okay. Also Jeroboam, son of Nebat, rebelled against the king. He was one of Solomon's officials, an Ephraimite from Zeredah, and his mother was a widow named Zeruiah. Here is the account of how he rebelled against the king. Solomon had built the supporting terraces, and he had filled the gap in the wall of the city of David his father. Now Jeroboam was a man of standing, and when Solomon saw how well the young man did his work, he put him in charge of the whole labor force of the house of Joseph.
Great. There. Where there's a whole bunch of detail about why Jeroboam ended up fleeing. But to understand, Jeroboam is an official in the Solomon's reign. This is before the split between the two kingdoms. This is when the split happened. So at that point in time, Solomon is king of all of this territory. Okay, and it's one of the only periods in all the history of Israel. David and Solomon, the only periods in all the history in Israel when these foreign empires aren't completely dominating the region. Israel's sort of independent right now. But Solomon is, as all the house of David are, based in Jerusalem and mostly centered on the interests of Jerusalem. And so his trades and things with neighbors are benefiting Jerusalem and Judah a lot more than they're benefiting Samaria and Israel up north. And so when Solomon dies, Jeroboam and a few other people basically say, well, why should Solomon's kids, why should the house of David rule forever? Like, maybe someone from the north should get a chance because you're not representing our interests well. And he ends up leading a rebellion, gets forced to flee. And Solomon's son, Rehoboam, takes over, and we're going to read a little bit about Rehoboam. So I'm jumping now to chapter 12 in verse 1. And let's go ahead and read to verse 11.
Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all the Israelites had gone there to make him king. When Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, heard this, he was still in Egypt, where he had fled from King Solomon. He returned from Egypt. So they sent for Jeroboam, and he and his whole assembly of Israel went to Rehoboam and said to him, "Your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you." Rehoboam answered, "Go away for 3 days and then come back to me." So the people went away. Then King Rehoboam consulted the elders who had served his father Solomon during his lifetime. "How would you advise me to answer these people?" he asked. They replied, "If today you will be servant to these people and serve them and give them a favorable answer, they will always be your servants." But Rehoboam rejected the advice that the elders gave him and consulted the young men who had grown up with him and who were serving him. He asked them, "What is your advice, and how should we answer these people who say to me, 'Lighten the yoke your father put on us'?" The young man who had grown up with him replied, "Tell the people who have said to you, 'Your father put a heavy yoke on us, but make our yoke lighter.' Tell them, 'My little finger is thicker than my father's waist. My father laid on you a heavy yoke, I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whip, and I will scourge you with scorpions." And how far?
That's great. That's perfect. Yeah. Okay. All right, so we have a scene here almost like out of like Game of Thrones or something, right? Where we have a young king, an arrogant young king, and he has grown up with wealth and privilege his whole life, and he does not negotiate well with his lords, with his counselors. He has Jeroboam, who represents the interests of the north. Jeroboam had rebelled before Solomon's death and been driven away to Egypt, but he's back now that Solomon's dead and Rehoboam is enthroned. And he's representing all the people in the north, basically saying, hey, Solomon's taxes were too high on us, and his treaties for trade and stuff weren't benefiting us enough. We will swear, your new king, Rehoboam, will swear to be faithful to you, but only if you lower our tax burden and give us some trade benefits for being faithful to you. If the house of David, in other words, wants to keep Israel, wants to keep the 10 tribes, this is our terms. We want you to lower our taxes. And Rehoboam says, give me 3 days to think about it. Goes, talks to his council, and this council of elders all say, you should do it. You should lower their taxes. Jeroboam's serious. They'll follow him. You should do it. They'll be faithful to you if you do it. You should do it. And Rehoboam he feels like that's going to be giving up too much, and asks his younger friends, and his younger friends are like, how dare they? You're king. You're powerful. You should tell them what the truth is. And so when Jeroboam comes back, Rehoboam's answer is, if you think my dad was bad, I'm going to be so much worse. If you thought being under his burden of his taxes was like being whipped with scourges, it's going to be like being whipped with scorpions under me. I'm going to tax you to death. And Jeroboam's like, okay, that's how you want it. And then he walks out and takes 10 tribes of Israel with him. Builds an army and says, go ahead, send your taxmen, we'll kill them. And that's how Israel and Judah end up splitting into two distinct areas. Jeroboam is chosen to be king of the northern section and builds a capital in the northern section in a place called Samaria, which is between Bethel and Penuel, which are two of the holiest places in the northern area. Bethel has been associated since its inception with Jacob, with the namesake of Israel. That's where his whole ladder experience dream was, and also where he later on had his home and his family and stuff. So it's sacred to the northern tribes. It's important for ancient reasons. And these are the two high places in the north as well. Bethel and Shechem are the two high places, and that's where the temple and worship is. So he puts his capital right between them, Samaria, and he starts ruling a separate kingdom. Now this is 14 kings before Josiah, so we're talking generations before Josiah. By the time we get to Josiah, this split has been in place for like 170, 180 years, something like that. It's been a while that is there. I want one more piece about Jeroboam here, and then we're going to jump. So I would like to start reading in verse 25 of chapter 12. Can I have a different reader now as a new volunteer? I'll grab it. That's fine. So starting in verse 25, then Jeroboam built Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and resided there. He went out from there and built Penuel. Then Jeroboam said to himself, now the kingdom may well revert to the house of David if this people continues to go up to offer sacrifices in the house of Lord at Jerusalem. The heart of this people will turn to their master, King Rehoboam of Judah. They will kill me and return to King Rehoboam of Judah. So the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold. He said to the people, you have gone up to Jerusalem long enough. Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. He set one in Bethel and the other in Dan. I said Bethel and Shechem. It's Bethel and Dan. And this thing became a sin, for the people went to worship before the one at Bethel and before the other as far as Dan. He also made houses on high places and appointed priests from among all the people who were not Levites. Jeroboam appointed a festival on the 15th day of the 18th month, like the festival that was in Judah, and he offered sacrifices on the altar. So did in Bethel, sacrificing to the calves that he had made. And he placed in Bethel the priests of the high places that he had made. He went up to the altar that he had made in Bethel on the 15th day in the 18th month, in the month that he alone had devised. He appointed a festival for the people of Israel, and he went up to the altar to offer incense. All right, so this here is a description of what Jeroboam does and how Jeroboam sets about establishing his rule, his kingdom in the north and there. If it isn't already self-evident in the text, remember that almost all of this, the Bible that we have, was written by the priesthood in the house of David in Jerusalem, is written representing the Judean perspective as there. This is not how Jeroboam would have seen things, right? They're describing what Jeroboam did, but not from Jeroboam's perspective. They're describing it from their perspective. And they're saying that Jeroboam, what he did was realize that if he tried to be king over this northern area, but most of the people were still traveling down to Jerusalem to worship, that his rulership would be on shaky ground. They would be split loyalties. They would be faithful to the temple in Jerusalem, even as they were supposed to be following him up here in the north. And he knows that the temple and the house of David are, fairly closely aligned with each other. And so he doesn't want them going to worship in Jerusalem. He wants them to worship here where they are. And so he creates 2 new places for them to worship. And he puts 2 golden calves in those places as sort of symbols of where they can worship, and establishes new festivals and performs sacrifices at those altars. Anyone remember any other stories about golden calves in the Old Testament?
Moses, Aaron.
Yeah, right. Moses, Aaron. They don't actually explicitly reference it because they don't have to, because it would be obvious to any reader of the period reading it and hearing it there. But the implication here is that he is committing a very bad act of idolatry by doing this there. And there's multiple bad actions in here. He takes away worship from the temple, which by the writers of this book is a bad thing because they're from the temple. He establishes new holy sites that he has no right to. Why? He is not a priest. He puts new priests there who aren't from the line, who aren't Levites, who aren't the people that Moses assigned to the priesthood. He puts in these 2 golden calves, which are awfully lot like the calf that Aaron was, indicted for, for making a bad choice about doing. And then he performs the sacrifices himself as if he were a priest, which is also a violation in there. He's taking away the jobs of the priests, and he's taking away the influence of the temple, and all of these choices to do it. Now, we don't have Jeroboam's version of events, but some things to understand about this is that we know from archaeological records and also from elsewhere in the Bible that this is not entirely true. Bethel and Dan, Jeroboam didn't create them. They were there, like I said, Jacob lived in Bethel hundreds of years before there. It was already a sacred site. People were already going to worship in Bethel. He didn't make it a holy site, but they're giving Jeroboam all the credit and all the blame here for doing it by claiming that Jeroboam was responsible for this. There's a reason they want Jeroboam to be responsible for it, is there. But there was already a site for that. Furthermore, the two calves, which they mention here, and they call them calves, we have illustrations of them from Egyptian writings and the Assyrian writings. When they conquered them, they're gold, right? So they took them. We have illustrations of them. They're not calves, they're bulls, and they look very, very, very much like the two bulls that were underneath the Ark of the Covenant, holding the Ark of the Covenant up in Jerusalem, in the temple. In other words, it's very likely that what he was doing was not inviting people to worship the statues of the bulls, but he was doing what the temple was doing in claiming these two bulls are like holding up the pedestal, the footstool of God. And by placing one bull in Bethel and the other bull in Dan, he's basically boasting that his temple is bigger than Jerusalem's temple. God's footstool, our God, our place of worshiping Yahweh, is so big, it can't even be contained in one city or one temple. It spreads over, because Samaria is right between them, it spreads over half the region of Israel in the middle here. Like, Yahweh is bigger here and more powerful here than he is in Jerusalem. So it's very, and now, again, we don't have his version of events, so we don't get to know exactly what he meant by it there. But from the artist's depictions and things, the likely intent of this was him to sort of undermine the temple and say, this is here. He was probably not worshiping someone different than Yahweh. He was still worshiping Yahweh, but the worship was intended to sort of say, look how grand our kingdom is. Look how great it is. We have a temple that spans the whole countryside. Is there. But the priests in Jerusalem, of course, don't want to frame it that way. That makes them look bad. They would rather frame it as in he's inviting people to worship golden calves. They're worshiping idols. And we already all know that that's a bad thing to do. So we have two warring perspectives about what's going on here. And I saw it. Tom, yeah.
One of the 12 tribes is Dan, which their land was east of Jordan. Is that the same Dan here? Is it a different Dan?
Dan is here a city. That is, yeah. So yeah, technically, the tribe of Dan. Here, I'll use orange because I haven't used orange on the map. The tribe of Dan is like this territory, but it actually has a little bubble that goes like this. And so the city of Dan is like right here. Yeah, it is on the west side of the Jordan, east of Samaria. And Bethel is west of Samaria. So one bull on each side of Samaria, kind of implying Samaria is like right between the feet of God, right? Okay? So Jeroboam has committed this sin in the temple's eyes. 14 kings ago, they've been mad about it for a long time. It's not new. But they've been looking for, in the past, Israel had a bigger army, had more money, had more power. There was no chance of the house of David taking Israel back in previous generations. But now, Assyria has conquered Samaria, has taken away those golden calves and in loot and treasure, and left the people there. And Josiah is presented an opportunity to maybe reclaim this territory, and he needs a narrative or a reason for justifying it. And here's the narrative they've come up with. Samaria and Israel, they made a bad choice in worshiping idols and stuff. We can tell you when they started doing it. It was when they left the house of David, when Jeroboam built those golden calves and told you not to come worship in the temple. That's when the problem started for Israel. And then it was always going to lead to this. Eventually, God is patient, so God took a long time. God, 180 years or something like that. God waited and waited for you to repent, but you didn't. And so finally Assyria came and punished you for your idolatry and for your lack of worshiping in the temple and for intermarrying with your neighbors. And so here's our chance for Jerusalem to get all of those worshipers up here who used to come to the temple but who have now been going to Bethel and Dan for generations to start coming back to Jerusalem for worship, and also for the house of David to reclaim the land and territory and people and tax base that they lost when the kingdoms split. And the proof that this is so and the argument that this is so is we found this holy book in the temple. And this holy book tells us, how can you argue? It's the word of God, literally found in God's temple by God's high priest. How could you doubt it? Plus, we have this extremely pious king who everyone saw tear his clothes and bow and scrape, and he's been giving offerings in the temple every day since then. He reads the book. He never turns from the left or the right. He follows in the footsteps of David. He's the best king we've had in generations, the most faithful, the most pious, the most religious king. And so this is a chance for renewal for Israel to do this. So the last question I have here before we're already over time. Man. All right. Last question I have for us here before we go forward is just what scholars think that book was. And I guess because we're over time, rather than belabor the point, the scholars have labeled this book what they call the Deuteronomistic history. And the Deuteronomistic history is called such because it is the book of Deuteronomy plus Joshua, Judges, and most of 1st and 2nd Kings. So the book that we're talking about is a book that essentially tells the story from the house of David's perspective with laws that are designed to support the house of David's claim that they should be in control of all of Israel. And I'm going to give you just real quick one very clear example of what that law looks like. Deuteronomy is full of commandments against idolatry, far more so than even in Leviticus. But here is something that Deuteronomy uniquely has that does not exist elsewhere in Leviticus or Numbers or other parts of the Torah. Deuteronomy, by the way, the name Deuteronomy just means second law. That's what it means in Greek. It is called so because it is very clearly like a repetition, rehashing with slight changes in emphasis of the law that already is there. Most of Deuteronomy isn't different from, or it is different, but it's not like it's a repeat. The Ten Commandments exist twice in the Bible. It exists in Exodus, but it also exists in Deuteronomy. The laws about temple sacrifices exist in Leviticus, but they also exist in Deuteronomy. The laws about rectifying your wrongs with neighbors exist in Leviticus and Numbers, but they also exist in Deuteronomy. So like Deuteronomy is like takes the laws from all the other places and like coalesces them into one place. But it has a couple things that don't exist elsewhere, and one of them is in Deuteronomy 17, which is the only place in the law that talks about a king. And it's in Deuteronomy 17, starts in verse 14. When you've come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me, you may indeed set over you a king whom the Lord your God will choose. One of your own community you may set as king over you. You are not permitted to put a foreigner over you, who is not of your own community. Even so, he must not acquire many horses for himself, or return the people to Egypt in order to acquire more horses, since the Lord has said to you, you must never return that way again. And he must not acquire many wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away. Also silver and gold he must not acquire in great quantity for himself. When he has taken the throne of his kingdom, he shall have a copy of this law written for him in the presence of the Levitical priests. It shall remain with him, and he shall read in it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, diligently observing all the words of this law and these statutes, neither exalting himself above other members of the community, nor turning aside from the commandment, either to the right or to the left, so that he and his descendants may reign long over his kingdom in Israel. In other words, this is a description of what a good king looks like. A good king is super pious, reads the law every day, and follows it so faithfully, never turns from the right or the left, to the right or to the left, follows it in a straight line perfectly, as they're doing as there. The king is notably not a foreigner. So like people in the north who you're currently being ruled by Assyria, you should rebel against Assyria. You shouldn't permit Assyria to rule over you. The king does not get himself in debt and beholden to Egypt, trading for horses and trading for gold and silver. The king remains independent. Who's the only independent king in the region right now? The king is independent from these great powers, faithful, loyal, reads the rule in the presence of the Levitical priests specifically, not just any priests. There are other priests in Israel besides the Levitical priests, but the Levitical priests run the temple in Jerusalem and follows this there. So the reason scholars have held that these reflect particularly the perspective of the house of David, and particularly the perspective of the house of David starting with Josiah, is that this is we recognize here a particular argument for how to be king in this region. And it matches suspiciously well with how Josiah is described as being king in Jerusalem. So if that book they found in the temple was the core of or piece of essentially Deuteronomy that eventually became what we know as Deuteronomy and Joshua and Judges and so forth, then when we turn after our break here to looking at Joshua is sort of Josiah's big argument for how and why he is going to reclaim Israel. Joshua is the temple's basically document saying Josiah has the right to claim this area because, in fact, he is the new Joshua, the second Joshua. And we're gonna look at Joshua here after a quick 5-minute break.
Wow.